Hi, design students. We're going to go over some basic principles and elements of design, but also why we study design in general and kind of the value of design and art in society and different reasons why we may be interested in it as a people in general all over the earth. For this slideshow, we'll look at three main types of artwork, and there's 3 to 4 main types you could study in general to understand the principles, but also just in general. Sculpture, which is something we won't look at very much in this class, but is primarily, you could distinguish it to say it is concerned with 3 dimensions. So the type of art that has height, depth, and width would be sculpture, and it gets varied and complex. If you're interested in this, take my sculpture class. Architecture, which is 3D and also immersive. So in a way, probably the most utilitarian of all of them. And this kind of relates to our projects, well, our class, I should say, not too many of our projects, in the sense that they're planned on paper in 2 dimensions and become 3 dimensional objects. Same with sculpture too sometimes, but there's a lot more 2 dimensional plans of architecture, so that's interesting. The main one we're going to look at is pictures or pictorial arts. There's a lot of different ways that people have made these over the millennium. You have things as long ago as like cave paintings from the Paleolithic era, and then you have things like this, oil on canvas. There's tapestries, photography, drawing, painting, mosaics, the list goes on and on. So we'll be focusing on mostly on pictures of and pictorial arts of various kinds in this slideshow, but also in the class. Primarily drawing type of mediums when we're doing our work, paint and drawing. So where does this persistent and vital aspect of human experience originate? What persistent and vital aspect am I talking about? Making art, making design, making things aesthetic, providing form to formlessness. Well, part of it is that it's inborn. I believe that inside of almost everyone is a desire to create form from formlessness, to order things, and a general aesthetic desire and enjoyment of beauty. And this starts from a young age with blocks and dough and clay and all sorts of things, but that's a huge part of it. So it's something that we all sort of have within us, and we value it for various different reasons. One of the reasons we value it is because there's an intrinsic aesthetic value to art. There's a sort of beauty and something that really just touches us, right? This piece of art, you've probably seen it before. I think it's one of the most recognizable and reproduced piece of art of all time, Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Why is it so valuable? It's a one of a kind, of course, but why? It's actually just oil paint on cloth canvas with stretcher bars made out of wood. You could buy a canvas at your local store for, this size, $50 to $60, and the paint, so altogether the material value of it isn't actually very high, but it has the aesthetic value that makes it priceless, right? So there's something about the aesthetic experience that is of huge value to us as people. So why else do we study art besides it being an inborn impulse and the aesthetics of it? Well, in general, design and art, I'm using them kind of interchangeably because 2 dimensional art is designed, so is 3 dimensional art. But we have a value for design and art a lot of times because they represent our heritage culturally. So there's some way in which the works are actually part of our national or cultural identity. Um, this is a piece, part of a piece of a bunch of marbles from the Parthenon that Lord Elgin, who was an ambassador from the British, UK, was stationed over there in Greece, and he took these away with permission. Who knows exactly if he purchased them? I don't know the details, but he housed them inside the British Museum. Now, the Parthenon is in Greece, in Athens, and is a very, very important building to the Greeks and to many people because of its connection to democracy, and Athens being one of the early places of democracy. So there's been a lot of conflict over these marbles that were on the Parthenon. The Greek people want them back as part of their cultural heritage, but the British Museum is not giving them back. So this is just one little story example narrative around the idea that art and design can hold a cultural value for people. So it's another reason why we study design, is to understand how it's operating, and then by that operation, what it holds for a culture. Its context is part of that too. So yet another reason to value it and study it. Another reason that we value art and aesthetic objects, and two-dimensionally and three-dimensionally, is because they have a nationalistic value, and they also have a power associated with them. These two different structures, I'm sure you've seen these before, the pyramids of Giza, and you've maybe not seen this unless you've taken art history. It's Trajan's column. He was an emperor in Rome. Okay, they're different, totally different looking, but they're both operating in similar ways. These are giant tombs. Yes, we know that if you've studied Egypt at all, ancient Egypt, that the pharaohs were buried in these pyramids. But they were also symbols of power, right? Because they were giant, monumental, amazingly built, and totally kind of awe-inspiring in their day, and they still continue to be to people when they go to them. So whilst being a tomb for the pharaoh, they also had this other function to show the power of the empire, their great dynasties. Well, that's a nationalistic value. The same thing's happening over here with Trajan's column. This is a column in public, like a monument, and it has a continuous spiral relief carving on it that has to do with his victory, Trajan, the emperor, over another people group, the Dacians. So very, very much about, his identity as a conquering emperor, but also by proxy, the whole empire's identity as a victorious nation. Okay? These are both designed by architects, Imhotep and Apollodorus of Damascus. They have a particular design to communicate these ideas. And so when we study design, two-dimensional, three-dimensional design, we can understand how they're operating. We can understand how they're operating for the people back then in history, but also how they operate now. The kind of visual work that they do. I use this word operate a lot too, because I think that it's important to think about design in terms of how it's working or maybe not working, because it has a purpose or an intentionality behind it. Another reason we value art is memorial, as some kind of way of remembering people or events or things, the history and past, and sometimes to talk about, like this is Vanitas, a piece that's talking about the shortness of life and death. So there's something that we can talk about our values in it as well. But part of memorial, a huge part of it, beyond just representing history, is remembering particular people, right? Portraiture, has been around for a very long time, all the way back to ancient Egypt, to preserve the ka of a pharaoh. But we also get portraiture that's made by a particular person of themselves. This is Rembrandt. He's got a lot of self-portraits. So he's capturing himself as a particular person in a particular time, but we're able to see it hundreds of years later still. And so he, in his portrait, is persisting past his life. There's a kind of way in which art can be a persisting event. It's in the now, but it can be from long ago, historically. And so we have portraiture, not just painted portraiture, but photography, printmaking, drawing, all the different ways we could capture the likeness of someone, being a way of remembering, right? And this is a common idea today. We have an infatuation, we could say, almost with our cameras and documenting our lives and our kids and brothers and moms and dads' lives, right? So this is an important thing. Why do we want to do that? Well, I would suggest possibly to remember in our life what happened, and also possibly to preserve it after death, right? Another reason we value art, and this is pretty common, especially back in other eras maybe, where we have early Christian art, the Roman art, we have statues that are put in temples, all different types of things, but still now, this is an icon from Byzantine Empire back in the 10th century, 9th century. We have a lot of value for art for religious purposes. We value it in design in that way too. There's icons that people pray towards. Even now, though, there's new cathedrals put up at times, and like Washington D.C. has the National Cathedral. There's stained glass windows in it. You know, there's a lot of reasons why people have valued art over the ages. Well, one of them that's been really strongly a part of it is religious value, and I think that continues today in some different forms and fashions, maybe not as strongly as it once did. But maybe a part of religious, it's not religious, but another value that would be psychological and of the mind, and our value set, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So maybe not religious, but part of our values would be the psychological value of art. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean the way in which a piece of art, and this is an important part of studying it, design, affects the viewer psychologically. And then in a way, we could say also there's a value for making art for people because of the psychological effect and release of emotion and different things it has on them personally. But I'm specifically talking here about, want to point out how what we make and look at can affect us quite a lot. And we want to be able to unpack how that happens and why it happens. So this is something we value in art, but also part of what we have to and are going to try to learn in this course is how is the work that we're making and looking at, what is it doing? What's it doing to the viewer's mind? How are they seeing it? How are they perceiving things? So this piece has a very peaceful quality to it. Monet used to paint on his estate in Givenchy, and it's greens and cool and has water and reflections. So it's very peaceful feeling. There's other types of things that have different kind of psychological effects, and maybe we value those as well for different reasons, right? So definitely a reason why we value art. Now, another thing we value is it's for its communication, direct experience, art and illusion. This is interesting here. This says this is not a pipe in French. And he titles this The Treason of Images. Why is that? Well, you say, well, of course it's a pipe. No, it's a picture of a pipe, right? And this artist, Magritte, he's a surrealist. He's trying to get us to think about the way in which we associate symbols and images with actual things, and the kind of slippery slope that can be messed with there. We value, though, art because it has a direct experience that's worth a lot, right, to us. We could try to describe something like this: a bridge over water with lilies, yada, 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 etc., etc. Well, sometimes a picture really is worth 1,000 words, and so there's a way we can communicate, and we value the ability of art to communicate in a way that's different, more direct than just talking about it or using words or writing, right? So that's another reason why we study it. And in our culture today, there is a proliferation I mean, so many types of imagery coming at us all the time on the online, through movies, through advertisements. Go on and on and on and on. You can go on and on about it, right? But it's important for us to be able to really dissect and understand what it's doing so that we can become more aware as people who are involved in those type of things as a career or profession. Maybe you're taking this class because you want to be able to be a designer or an illustrator. And so to be able to do that effectively, you need to become aware of what's happening when you're looking at things. But even if you're just not that interested in it, except for you want to occasionally make art and as a hobby, I think it's good to be able to be aware of what's happening in these things so you can know what is it that these people are trying to communicate to me when they're presenting this image, and to kind of be more aware as a human about the kind of things people are selling or what they're trying to make you buy or maybe believe when you're looking at things. So that's kind of a way of unpacking the power of the communication of it so that you're not just blindsided. There's a lot of traditions, and a traditional view and role of the artist has to do with the kind of idea that artists create as God creates. A quote from Durer back in the Renaissance era. There's this idea that, originally with a lot of cultures, that even ancient Greece, that the muses were speaking through the artists. And that's kind of something that we get from long ago. I think now people more likely think of artists as people who make art, and that's about it. If you make art, then you're an artist. That's fine too. You have to think about your own ideas about that, but I think that we could say that for our purposes in this class, it's best to just not worry too much about if you're good enough or if you have the skill or not, or if you're an artist or if you're not an artist, but just to jump in and dive in and just start making work and learning about it. So we're going to talk next a bit about some of the language around art and design. They're both very similar. Design is part of art, and art is part of design. I think one of the differences is that design sometimes, as a field, is specifically about functionality. A lot of it is maybe about communication directly, and some of it has a commercial aspect to it. But really, in this class, two-dimensional design, we're not talking about commercial things only. We're really talking about the design of works in two dimensions, which is what? Height and width, no depth, on flat pieces of paper, and by proxy it'd be the same type of things with screens and photography and anything else, but we're mostly going to use paper, paint, ink, pencil, things like that. So it's not really a course that's just designed for graphics, for graphic artists, or something that's commercial or a job in that way, but really it's like any of that. So all of them, though, have a common language, and we could say that yes, art does have a language. It's not a written language in the sense of an alphabet, but it has a particular rules and styles and elements to it. And this piece by Calder is playing with that idea a lot. And even letters are, connected to originally little pictures of things before they got simplified and simplified and simplified. So let's talk about some of the terminology we might use. One thing we would say sometimes quite a lot is composition. Composition as a term. You'll hear this term over and over again and when you read about art. So what is composition? Composition is the overall plan or structure of a work of art. It's the relationship between its component parts. So this is pretty clear here because it's pretty simple piece, but we have like only a certain number of colors and a lot of very similar type of shapes. But these formal elements, squares of red, blue, yellow, white, and lines of black, are distinctly arranged into a relationship, right? And that's the composition. It's distinct from subject matter and content and themes. It's not about that. It's about the arrangement of the component parts. So it's more of a formal type of thing than it is about like meaning. But it, of course, this is where things always get tricky. But of course, the way you compose that is how you create meaning. And so form and content always end up coming together. And we'll talk more about some of those ideas about content in a little bit. But first, let's get through some more of the formal terms. We say things like form, like the form of this piece in the art, or the overall form of something. It really has to do with both the shape and the structure. So it can refer to the overall form taken by the work, which is kind of related closely to the terminology of composition. But it could also be referring to elements of shape. So sometimes people will say that form here, and they really mean the shape or the three-dimensional shape volume. So this is kind of a word that's used in different ways. So I pull it out, and we could actually say, we could use it in relationship closely with the element of shape, but I want to pull it out and talk about it because of the way it's used in two different ways some of the time. So we could think about, I keep mentioning elements and principles, so let's talk about what those are. Principles and elements of design. You'll hear a lot about this. There's different names for different principles, and some people break them up a bit differently. I'll point out different ones too throughout the slideshow and the presentation. And then there's sometimes the elements are often named exactly the same thing by most people. They're usually not changed up quite as much because you can just call line line. There's not as many names for it. So these ones kind of get different names depending on the system that people use to name them. But we'll talk about principles and then we'll talk about elements. The relationship between them, the principles and formal elements, are like bricks or building blocks to plans. Principles would be like an architectural plan, ways in which you organize space or think about organizing and making a design that is effective. Principles for designing well. Elements are more like bricks. They are things like lines and shapes. They're the things you use to build with. Okay? So we're going to dive into a few of the principles and then we'll go into kind of just making clear the elements, because there's parts of the elements that aren't exactly just one way only. Like there's, for example, with line, different qualities of line and types of line we'll talk about. Unity and variety, a principle in a composition. I pulled this back up, this image again of a composition to kind of get you to think again about it. So what is the unity of it? What is the variety of it? Well, there's a variety of square shapes and rectangular shapes in different colors, right? But it has a lot of unity because of the way in which it's very gridded together, and it has a unity because of the white used throughout it, so it pulls our eye to it. It has visual interest because this giant red shape that's very solid in the middle of it. But then this dynamic between all these smaller shapes and this big one creates a balance to it. So this is the idea of unity and variety as a principle. Unity being the thing that holds it together, and variety maybe being the thing that makes it interesting in certain ways. We can see this here in the size and shape of the different type of glasses. So there's a recognition of the same subject matter, right? Sunglasses are glasses. And they're similar shapes. They're even kind of on a grid, like I say in my note below. But there's a variation that gets our eye moving throughout it. So this is tied in a way to rhythm and repetition, another thing we'll talk about later. But it's got a uniformity to it. It feels very balanced as well, another principle. But it has variety to make it visually interesting. You can get unity and variety by proximity, how close things are to each other. If we pull them apart, they feel like they're not meant to be together. There's a lot more variety. When you place them close, you feel more of a unity because they're right next to each other. How else do we create unity and variety? Continuation or continuity is a line of visual movement, and this creates a unity in the way our eye moves throughout the piece. So you have a focal point, which is another principle or emphasis that draws your eye in, and then we get a visual unity because our eye moves throughout the piece and brings us into every part of it. And this creates an interesting unity, but also a variety because there's a lot of different shapes being an element, but they're repeated, right? So that also is another concept. So the point is that they often work together. These elements and principles is not any one of them. They're not in isolation so much as that they work together. But when we do our projects, we're going to be trying to highlight certain ways of using a particular element or principle and knowing how they affect each other and being able to kind of really understand them. There's another way people use this a lot is the grid. So the grid being there's an underlying sort of organization of somewhat rectangular things that are on like a grid, like big city blocks that have been laid out. But in this piece, he's kind of messed with it a little bit to give it some interest visually and variety. So it keeps some interest, but it has a unity because there's an underlying grid to the piece. Contrast is part of unity and variety. So contrast gives variety. Some people in certain systems of naming things and elements and in the elements and the principles, they would make this its own principle, the principle of contrast. But we can see it sometimes done through color, it's done through value, it's done through pattern. There's a lot of different ways that you can contrast things through line quality, right? But it creates unity because there's a repetition of something, and also variety because there's more of them, so that's contrast. How is it being used here? Interesting. This is a kind of funny piece by Botero that's knocking off a famous Renaissance painting. He does all of his figures where they're like inflated, become more full, the wrinkles and everything's like almost as if it's been inflated. Well, there's a lot of contrast here between the green dress and the red, which are different colors. They're complementary colors, something we'll talk about also later. Opposites on the color wheel, and so it gives a lot of contrast in the piece. But it has a sort of focal point here from the way in which all these lines lead to it, and that would be something else that would be a principle. So this piece is operating with a lot of different types of principles and elements, but this is just one part of it is contrast or variety. There's a principle of scale and proportion. Scale being the largeness or smallness of something, and proportion being connected to one to the other. So the scale of one thing compared to the scale of something else. This is a really important thing we do when we're drawing something accurately. We're trying to visually reproduce something on a flat surface. This guy is using the system of measuring, visual measuring, to get this scale on his paper accurately. So scale is kind of thought about in lots of different ways, but we could think about, the overall scale of something as a way of paying attention to it or how it operates. That could be small, really things that are really small or really large can end up becoming really noticeable. And then also principle of how things should be in relationship to each other. So one of the things that matters a lot to us as people is human scale. Things that operate in a way that makes sense for a human to use. Huge role in how things are designed, objects, and also then in illusory spaces when we're having picture planes we know are kind of human scale, and we relate a lot of things to human scale. Another part of this connected to human scale but in more detail is the head, the face. If you have two dots in an oval, you automatically will start to think of it as a face. It's called pareidolia because we're so attuned to human faces and the scale of the human head that it becomes an obvious thing for us, even though it's two dots, a circle, and a line, right? Everyone as a kid has drawn some type of smiley face, and that's automatically a face, right? Because the scale is somewhat, even though it's not even barely accurate, it's somewhat there, so we automatically relate it that way. This can be a way of creating emphasis, which is another principle. If something's really, really large, in ancient art history, they did this a lot with certain people groups with their art. If the king would always be portrayed quite a lot bigger, it's called hierarchical scale, but it automatically creates emphasis. This is kind of a comical sort of piece. Magritte's a surrealist, so he has a lot of fanciful things. But the apple is impossible to ignore, right? Through scale. This brings up the next principle I want to talk about, emphasis or focal points. In this piece, it is The Girl by Rousseau. You automatically notice her. She's going diagonal. She's lighter than the background. She's a human shape. We automatically notice that in general anyway, right? There's a lot of ways to create emphasis and focal points in work. And it's a really important principle because when you make work, you want people to look at it. And emphasis, or the places of emphasis, are where people pay attention to. And that's how you get people to look at your work longer, right? In this piece, it's the saint who's going sort of diagonally compared to most everyone else's upright-ish. Everyone's sort of pointing to him. There's a lot of different gestures towards him. He's also light in white clothing on a black background. And then the warmer colors overall, reds, are right by him. And then the other persons wearing them are kind of pointing to him. So this is all reasons why he's being pointed out in the emphasis of it. Not to mention there's like angular and round. He's got some kind of different shapes going on. I have some other things over here about contrast. Dark and light, distorted and clear, angular and round. There's different ways that you could have emphasis and focal points through pieces. Another way of emphasis is through the placement of an object. This one's interesting because it also uses color to reinforce it, red and green being opposites on the color wheel. But you can't help but notice this on a person's face. It's pretty interesting how immediately placing something in the right spot will give you an emphasis upon it. All right, we're going to talk about a next principle, which is balance. Balance is a really felt sensibility. If you think about if you're ever about ready to trip or if you're off kilter, then that's a loss of balance. Well, it's the same thing visually. It's a feeling of balance. It doesn't have to be symmetrical always. This is a symmetrical balance, sometimes called formal balance. But it has to be it's about visual weight being the same. And there's lots of different ways to make the visual weight the same. And this, it's just literally the same. If you drew a line down it, it's the same on each side. That's symmetrical. Asymmetrical or informal balance is visual weight that's achieved the same despite it not being exactly the same on either side. And Bernini's David is a great example of that. If you drew a line down it, he has ways of drawing your attention to other sides of the composition despite the fact that it's not exactly the same. What kind of balance, we return to Monet's bridge, what kind of balance do you think this has? Well, it's almost symmetrical if you drew a line down it, but not quite. So it would be called near symmetrical balance is what we would call it. Near symmetry. N-E-A-R. Not quite symmetrical, but almost there. Rhythm and repetition, a principle of design. It gives us some visual interest. It's kind of about very related to unity and variety, and even balance in a way, and contrast. It's about shapes that have a repetition throughout something and the rhythm of how they move through the space. And it also is about moving our eye. So we're starting, which is called continuity. We're starting to get an understanding while we're talking about how these things interrelate with each other. Here's the rhythm or repetition, the umbrella shape, right? You can see it in a lot of different pieces. It doesn't just have to be shapes. It can also be through overall gestalt, which is overall shape, but it can be through color too. So we're getting a repetition of colors. The scale repetition. This is a small shape and a large shape. They're all kind of somewhat similar. And in here we're getting it through a repetition of color throughout it, which creates a rhythm, and then a repetition of sort of flags. And there's difference and similarity are part of this, right? So we've talked a bit about difference and similarity before as well. In our unity and variety, some people would call unity and variety, they would label it as difference and similarity. So these things are really interconnected with each other. And you can see how when we're talking about work, it's hard to talk about it completely only as one principle because they interrelate to each other. So we're going on to elements of design now, and line is one of the most ubiquitous elements of design. It's everywhere, so much so that we don't even think about it some of the time. Ubiquitous meaning everywhere. There's all sorts of lines, and what a line would mostly be described as, it's got length, right, and direction. But one of the things it's described as a point moving. Moving point, a point that has moved in the record of it, right? This could be on the screen. In person, it would be, a pencil, a pen, whatever it could be, whatever material you use. It's the same idea that a point has moved in some way, creates a line. In geometry, lines have certain other principles we could talk about. But really, I want to talk about with you is the quality of line. So there's lines that are regular. They have like verticality, horizontality, diagonal in a way that feels very geometric. And there's lines that feel very irregular. They're all over. They have different thickness and thinness. But one of the main things that you want to think about with line is how they're in relationship to each other. Parallel, perpendicular, converging, intersecting. So we talked about pareidolia before. This is pareidolia, where we automatically see facial expressions and faces in these lines. This is similar types of line shapes, but the different mediums used to create them, brush and ink versus a pen, create a very different quality to them. And lines have quality in that way. And when we're using line, we want to think about the type of quality we want that communicates our ideas. This is an example of a print from Heinrich Clay, and you can see it has a sort of quality because it's actually an etching. The way it's been made creates a certain type of line. So those lines were made by printing press, and it was etched inside of a plate and then inked and then pressed. So it has a quality to it because of the way it was made. And I think that's an important part of what we're going to need to think about when we're making things is the quality of the materials, what the materials we're working with, how they want to work, and the kind of quality that they produce. A pencil line produces a very much different quality than an ink brush, right? A mechanical pencil is very different from even a pencil that has a soft lead. So we want to think about the quality to the materials we use and how they're best suited or used. And that'll be an important part of kind of making some design decisions. So I think we're going to stop here for today, and we're going to pick up on the next lecture, which will be continuing on with actual line and types of line, and then the rest of the elements in design. Okay, so we're going to stop here, line quality, and then proceed to lecture number 2, where we pick up on types of line and then go through the rest of the elements. All right, guys, hopefully you're doing well out there, and I'll talk to you soon.